We are now ready. So, as our keynote speaker for this conference, we are extremely delighted to have Janice Gump speak to us all. And I just have to have something come up here. So, Janice received her bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago, and she's a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Rochester. She has been a faculty member of the Howard University Medical School and Howard University Psychology Department, a staff member of the University Counseling Service, and a faculty member at the Washington School of Psychiatry. She's been a consulting editor for the Journal of Counseling and Clinical Psychology, a reviewer for the Mental Health Small Grants Committee of IMH, and a member of the Professional Psychology Editorial Board. She's authored many papers on African American women, shame, and the enduring consequence of slavery's trauma. She maintains a private practice in Washington, D.C., and is a member of the Institute of Contemporary Psychotherapy and Psychoanalysis. Dr. Gump.
And you can hear me?
Yeah.
And I am very glad to be here. My paper today discusses what was clearly the most determining aspect of African American being or subjectivity in this country, but also what may well have been one of the most determining aspects of the United States, economically, culturally, and to those who achieved and supported it, that is, slavers and their supporters. Not as fully do I discuss the latter, but one day, because I think it is as important, if not more important, to understand those who do the victimizing as to understand those who have been victimized. This is a paper about the transmission of slavery's traumas, but more importantly, about the effects of those wounds upon the generations of children that slaves produced. I will conclude by sharing with you a recent revelation I have had with regard to what history has brought to me. I refer in this first sentence to some paragraphs that preceded it, and in those paragraphs, people like Jefferson and others are either talking about how unimportant slavery was to the Civil War, or about what an enormous loss slavery was to this country. As a descendant of slaves, the above astounds me. Given the act of African enslavement, the Middle Passage during which some 2 million died, rape, psychological as well as physical abuse, captivity enforced by laws, fences, and roaming paddy rollers who beat slaves found outside plantation boundaries, the selling of mothers from children, fathers from families, siblings divided and separately sold, the prohibition of learning, and finally, the all-encompassing, irremediable message of defective. The contention of slavery's benevolence is stunning. Only if slaves were governed by laws other than those regarding humanity as a whole could the thesis be found acceptable. Such beliefs, however, as well as the denial undergirding them, continue to haunt both descendants and the nation. I shall use Atwood and Stollerow's understanding of trauma and relevant constructs in discussing several topics. Initially, I will present their conceptualization of trauma. Subjectivity will then be examined, or rather structures of subjectivity, which are the distinctive configurations of self and other that shape and organize a person's subjective world. The slave subjectivity is one manner in which the what of transmitted trauma may be determined, and I will discuss those aspects I find most significant, as well as give examples of its manifestation in present-day descendants. All of the patients I present are African American. It is difficult to imagine descendants not haunted in varying degrees by the matters discussed. The traumas of slavery and their transmission the traumas of slavery and their transmission are thus relevant to the therapy of all African Americans, whether made explicit or not. Therapists working with African American patients need have such knowledge, but the culture's treatment of African Americans is relevant not only to blacks, but to whites as well, because they too have been determined by it. It is this determination which Lynn Jacobs writes of in Psychoanalytic Inquiries, Analytic Lives in a Wounded World. Both Jacobs' paper and my response to it discuss the work in which whites need engage in order for racism's effect upon whites to become clear. It is, after all, as necessary for the white therapist to know self as to know other, and this aspect of the self is particularly important, in part because it is less visible. I will also explore slavery's injurious impact upon the slave's sense of self, an impact which has been transmitted as well. My paper will close with a discussion of transmission, as well as sharing with you of this personal experience that has been so important to me. The term trauma has been used to describe a wide array of psychological states, ranging from caregiver-infant interactions to the shattering and devastating effects of war, rape, and concentration camp phenomena. Atwood and Stollerow define the term in a manner that identifies the central phenomenon common to all. For more than 2 decades, these theorists and others have maintained that trauma comprises an unbearably painful affective state which fails to be met with a containing, modulating, and regulating response. The relational context is essential to their thinking, indeed to their very definition of trauma. Trauma is not an external or even internal event, but the experiencing of unbearable affects in a context wherein modulating, containing, integrating responsivity fails to occur. It is this contextual process of which trauma is comprised. The traumas of slavery. I've often used the word trauma to refer to events taking place during slavery, though such use is appropriate, it is also misleading and, according to Stollerow and Atwood, inappropriate, because it obscures the fact that the state of slavery in and of itself was traumatic. For instance, the most fundamental principle of slavery was the contention that blacks were inferior to whites, inadequate, defective, in fact, not quite human. This belief preceded slavery, as it was born of European colonists' earliest encounters with black Africa. We can see this principle concretized in the definition of slaves as property, and the sale and purchase of them along with other properties and goods, such as cattle for women, or it's cattle were equivalent to men, pigs to children and women. Such practices produced a reality which reinforced notions of inequality, enforced detainment within the boundaries of the plantation, whether through the use of patrollers or locks placed on huts at night, was a kind of imprisonment, restricting information about the world and oneself in relation to it. And finally, it was the state of slavery that made possible the particular traumas occurring within it. For example, laws were established such as the necessity of written permission to travel outside the plantation, the breaking of which permitted those who found such a slave to physically abuse him or her. Here we see a particular trauma which owes its existence to the institution. The work of Socrates and Stollerow played a significant role in the conceptualization of affect as the primary motivator in human behavior, replacing drive, which had in psychoanalysis been viewed as the primary motivator. That work also grasped the necessity of intersubjective experience in the integration of affects. Thinking in terms of the centrality of affect and its occurrence within ongoing relational systems made it possible for Atwood and Stollerow to rethink many psychological phenomena, and trauma was one of these. When an infant or child experiences an intensely painful affective state within a context where pain is neither contained nor modulated, the affect becomes unbearable. It is the failure of the caretaker's attunement which renders these states unbearable and which prevents their integration. Atwood and Stollerow hold that in such instances the child loses the capacity for integrating affect, and, quote, unintegrated affect states become the source of lifelong emotional conflict and vulnerability to traumatic states because they are experienced as threats both to the person's established psychological organization and to the maintenance of vitally needed ties, end quote. Such traumas have been labeled developmental, a trauma many slaves endured. They are the most formative and enduring traumas, leading not only to the child's loss of affect integrating capacity, but to the establishment of irremediable principles of organization which can be altered neither by conscious intent or later experience. And I'll be talking about that in a bit when I talk about Bram Schaff's sense of self. Further, if these painful states have repeatedly evoked malattunement, the child comes to believe unconsciously that this malattunement and loss must derive from his own inherent defectiveness, his irreparable badness. This can be the source of lifelong and intense shame. A patient I saw many years ago presented a powerful demonstration of such processes. She was chronically depressed and felt acutely inadequate and guilty around her lack of desire for children. Clinically, she was anxious and hysterical and possessed an elusive kind of inappropriateness. She had, quote, whack attacks, end quote, in which she would cry hysterically and hit her head against a wall, manifesting the overwhelmed, disorganized state Atwood and Stollerow cite as one outcome of malattunement. Both she and her husband considered her immature and irresponsible about the mechanics of life, like paying bills, meeting him at a prearranged time. For years, she took clothes to a laundromat because she couldn't decide whether to have the garbage disposal or the washing machine fixed first, or how to go about doing either. Genetic work was difficult, as the patient could not accept that parents as wonderful as hers could in any way bear responsibility for her confusion and misery. Indeed, her mother and father were the envy of her friends as they were warm, open, and interested. Kids gathered at the patient's home as much to talk with her parents as with her. The father's birth and early childhood were mysterious. No one would ever tell my patient how he happened to be born on an Indian reservation. Though the family occasionally saw his mother, there was much distance between her father and his mother. The father never spoke of his early history. He revered his wife, this father, who was from a more privileged background and adored his child. He did. Theirs was the perfect home, there being no acknowledgement of father's rage, which subterranean ruled the house through the threats of eruption. That's why he had to have another family, my patient told me. Her father's rage would have spoiled what he esteemed the most, his wife and his child. And so to protect them and to keep from imploding, he created a receptacle in which his anger could be tolerated, a second secret family. There he slept with a gun under his pillow. For the most part, his father appeared to manage his rage through a dissociative process. Father cared for the patient in infancy and early childhood, and it was he who taught her emotions. He would grimace and say, "Now, what's this?" And the patient would respond, "Anger." Or, "What's this?" And she would say, "Surprise." Her recognition of feeling was to be from the outside in. It was not her anger, disappointment, or sadness which was to be labeled for. What could she know of such feeling? And should something slip through, Father would say, "What's the matter with your face? Fix it." Affects were qualities to be acquired through careful instruction. It was, she told me, a profound and critical moment in our work together when, angry with me, she leapt from her chair and began to walk. I quietly suggested she sit down and experience what she was feeling. She told me it was the first time she had ever felt anger. It need be remembered that my patient's principal early caregiver had been her father, a man whose history personally in relationship to his daughter suggests that in all probability he had experienced severe pain which had failed to be modulated or contained. His presentation of self as kind and loving within my patient's family, certainly not the kind of man who would sleep with a pillow, underneath which was a gun. And his establishment of a secret second family, which my patient and mother learned of only when he died, suggests, as I've noted, dissociative characterology. This case is a dramatic instance of developmental trauma. Not only does an initial instance of a child's painful affect fail to be met with a modulating, containing response, but the caregiver makes clear that the enhanced pain resulting from the first malattunement will be punished. You are allowed to feel joy, excitement, surprise. Sadness, anger, or disappointment is forbidden, and the consequence will be severe should you make a mistake. He had made it abundantly clear he would not only be malattuned, but critical and angry. It is the pain within such a context that renders the child's state unbearable, and it is the repetition of such interaction that produces the disorganized state. It isn't clear what mother's role in these interactions seems to have been, but it was minimal. In any case, it was clear father's messages prevailed. What was transmitted then was what must have been father's experience of malattunement when he was in pain, a response which contained and soothed failed to come forth. I have wondered if the father's mother was even present, but whether present or not, emotional holding appears absent, and her son thus lacked what was needed to hold his own child. Though many might speak of mother's ghost in such interactions, I prefer the word haunted. My sense, however, is that though unable to modulate and contain his child's greatest pains, he had somehow learned to give her much he had never experienced. When I worked with this patient, I knew less about trauma and its transmission than I do today. I had less comprehension of the aloneness, which must have been unbearable. I can't help but think I would have had greater empathy had I known. Nonetheless, the patient became more accepting of forbidden feelings, and both her disorganized state and depression diminished. She went back to school for an additional degree, and her professional life matured. And now, one of the most important things for me is the slave's subjectivity. Though my knowledge of slave subjectivity was enhanced by the slave narratives, it was Frederick Douglass, whose 1845 autobiography, given its insight and eloquence, which heightened my historical and affective understanding. Gates captured my experience. Gates was the one who reprinted Douglass's autobiography. Gates captured my experience of Douglass's work when he wrote in the introduction, Douglass's rhetorical power convinces us that he is the black slave, that he embodies the structures of thought and feeling of all black slaves, that he is the resplendent, articulate part that stands for the whole. I maintain that the first principle of slavery was subjugation, for which Random House offers two definitions. One, bringing under complete control or subjection, and the second definition, to make submissive or subservient. The dictionary thus distinguishes these related meanings, with the first relating to power and the second to subservience or submission. The African was indisputably controlled by his master, made to work at whatever task for however many hours, allotted shelter, food, and clothing according to the master's dictates, but I glean from my reading most masters also demanded subservience. Indeed, it appears that much of the violence towards slaves occurred in pursuit of this objective. The term broken is frequently used in discussion of slavery, and I came to understand that the process of breaking a slave referred to the success of subjugation. Frederick Douglass eloquently describes this experience. Due to death in his master's family, Douglass had had to leave his original master and come to live with another one who was a slaveholder destitute of every element of character commanding respect. This son doesn't like Douglass, and after 9 months sends him to live with a poor farm renter who was widely regarded for his ability to break slaves. And Douglass writes, if at any one time of my life more than another I was made to drink the bitterest dregs of slavery, that time was during the first 6 months of my stay with Mr. Covey. We were worked in all weathers. It was never too hot or too cold. It could never rain, blow, hail, or snow too hard for us to work in the field. The longest days were too short, and the shortest nights were too long for him. I was somewhat unmanageable when I first went, but a few months of this discipline tamed me. Mr. Covey succeeded in breaking me. I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. The disposition to read departed. The cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me, and behold, a man transformed into a brute. Though having been severely beaten by Mr. Covey, Douglass determines to walk the 7 miles to his master's store, to ask that he be removed. His request is refused and he is returned, and then one day, Covey intentionally surprises him, causing Douglass to fall. But at this moment, from whence came the spirit, writes Douglass, I don't know. I resolve to fight. He does, and he wins the immediate and larger battle. This battle was the turning point in my career as a slave. It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own manhood and inspired me again to be free. I now resolved that however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. A sense of self. Douglass's ultimate sense of self in his struggles with the slave broker are pronounced and triumphant, making the relevance of this construct incontrovertible in a consideration of slavery's effects. I suspected that though transitory, the sense of self was an authentic, perhaps even exultant experience in which one felt affirmed. Brandshaft, who I think initially wrote about the sense of self, Brandshaft's sense of self construct confirmed my feelings. He describes a defensive process initiated when the child's efforts to use his own feelings as central organizers of experience and behavior were stifled by attitudes and actions of caregivers. Describing his work with a patient who struggles to hold on to a sense of self, he writes, there is an underlying process at work that discloses skeletons below. Within this skeletal framework, experience is being shaped sequentially by two different and incompatible perspectives. One is the perspective of the child, who has the sense that his feelings can be used to organize his behavior and experience. But his own feelings are stifled by attitudes and actions of caretakers. Thus, the perspective and motivation that prevails is one in which the individual is compelled to submit to a definition of himself determined by forces external to his control or volition, a definition determined by the needs, wishes, and fears of caregivers or those who continue to represent them. Further, Brandshaft holds the most serious and lasting damage incurred by developmental traumata is that sustained by the emerging and fragile sense of self, though each step toward the realization of a demarcated and authentic personality is initially but fleetingly accompanied by a vitalizing and transcendent sense of self. In instances where the sense of slave is translocated, it is followed by the malaise and depletion of defeat and surrender, rooted in an underlying shift in the foundation of the sense of self. I'm going to talk about a patient whose sense of self is remarkable later on in the paper, in this paper. Two compositions of the sense of self are agency and the proscription of affect. Destruction of the slave's agency was critical to slavers and critically impairing of the slave. Bandura broadly defines agency as the capacity to exercise control over the nature and quality of one's life. He is referring to a capacity to desire, to formulate goals, to make relevant plans, to evaluate one's ability to enact such plans and then bring them about. In short, to have purpose, direction, and meaningfulness in one's life. I would add, a resultant sense of potency. For the most part, agentic faculties were antithetical to the institution of slavery, and not only were slaves held incapable of performing them, slave narratives suggest that in fact slaves were deficient in this regard. The following quote comes from ex-slave Anthony Dawson's narrative. The niggers kept talking about being free, but they wasn't free then and they ain't now. This is in 1936 or 37, when ex-slaves were asked to talk about slavery. Putting them free, just like putting goat hair on a sheep. When it rained, the goat come running and get into shelter because his hair won't shed the rain and he get cold. But the sheep ain't got sense enough to get in the shelter, but just stand out and let it rain on him all day. But the good Lord fixed the sheep up with a woolly jacket to turn the water off, and he don't get cold. You don't have to have no brains. The master's protection was like the woolly coat. But the emancipation come and take off the woolly coat and leave the nigger with no protection, and he can't take care of himself either. Most statements of being adrift were not as creative, but spoke to the reality of the freed slave situation. He was without money, knew little or nothing of what lay outside the plantation, and had no immediate job possibilities except those with his master. And so most of the ex-slave families in Yetman's collection of narratives remained on their plantations. It is clear that what was done to slaves produced the deficiency of function that they were then demeaned for lacking. How could someone held captive, forced to perform according to another's demands, controlled in almost every aspect of their existence, possess agency? Secondly, the proscription of affects and desire. Slavery demanded the slave's surrender of a sense of self. He must give up wanting shoes, his wife's continued presence, self-determined goals. I had believed this for many years, but it was a recent memory of me with my father that helped me understand the proscription of desire within black families. I no longer remember while my father was in a position where from time to time he would have boxes of candy in a closet in the house. Maybe he was connected in some way to wholesale goods, but for whatever reason, these bars were stored in our hall closet. One day, I decided to take one, and he caught me. "What are you doing?" he said loudly and with incredulity. I muttered that I wanted one. "Who cares if you want one?" he responded with anger and mocking. "I want $1 million too, so what?" I have written of my father who at the age of 8 was sent away from his family to live with a relative and who essentially raised himself. This very intelligent, poised, attractive man had struggled enormously to provide for us, as for most of his life he had been forced to accept occupations far beneath his capabilities due to racism. He had periods of severe depression where he would sit motionless on the couch for hours, perhaps listening to Bach, responding only with a faint smile when I sought to engage him. I knew something was terribly wrong with him, and given the conversations I had overheard, surmised his state was due to all that he yearned for but seemed unable to acquire despite immense effort. How selfish of me to think I should have what I wanted. I wasn't just guilty, but ashamed. Numerous iterations of such responses taught me to inhibit desire. Slavery prohibited dysphoric affects, anger, sadness, desire. Sadness rebuked the notion of slavery's goodness and could interfere with functioning. It was foolishly dangerous to be angry, to show resentment for some affront or command. And my father's personal history made his depression understandable. but only recently did I realize I was witnessing trauma transmitted. Proscription, used in the heading of this section, means to denounce or condemn as dangerous or harmful. It could be dangerous for the slave to ask for what he wanted, such as 3 rather than 2 meals, and the child could be condemned and certainly not cuddled for asking for what she desired. Thus, slaves who were brought here, who were torn from all that was comforting and familiar, even to the point of being separated from those who spoke the same language, may have experienced attunement prior to capture, but would probably have little of it available, given the trauma endured. How can a slave parent, so treated, listen, accept the anger and tears, sometimes loud wails of a child's disappointment? And when their descendants and parents when their descendants ask parents for a two-wheel bicycle, a lack of empathy is not surprising. I'm sure that I am holding you up from other presentations, and so I will again cut this short. Trauma is about death, whether it is the death of what was once conscious to that part of the self which is unconscious, in most instances never to live in awareness again, or whether it is the death of a life never to be experienced again, such as amongst Africans, torn from the lives they had lived, to be cast into the lives of slaves, or the death of the nascent self in the child who fails to be given that opportunity to experience and be led by his own feelings. I'm presently working with a patient who is clearly highly intelligent, economically very secure, and who has a good education, but who has no idea of a sense of self, of having a thought which he might follow in terms of an occupation. He does what his parents have taught him had to be done. They own an upper middle class business which is quite successful, and they have a fair amount of money, and it was quite clear that all of these children would want such an unusual site to work in when they matured. And so that's where he is, pretty unhappily. But what gets to me as his therapist and as someone who was infinitely more given gifts with respect to intellectual curiosity is his emptiness, especially intellectually, since he is so very smart. But I had an experience which was so profound for me, and I feel that I won't be able to convey to you why or how it was so profound. About the time I was invited to be a part of this conference, I was reading a book, the name of which is Homegoing, It was on the New York Times bestseller list for quite a while. It came out in 2016. And it's written by an African woman who grew up in the United States. And it's about what it was like in, I think it's Nigeria, but somewhere in Africa, around the time when some of us were captured. I had never known about the individual women or their children or how marriage was accomplished until I read this. I thought that I was someone who had experienced the trauma of slavery and what it had done to my parents and what they then did to us. There wasn't anything I could do about it except understand it as well as I could. But this book gave me the first experience I'd had of having a history, of having ancestors with a life that was full, certainly not rich. It was as if I could be alive in a way that I had never been before. So often, you must know that those who write about trauma write as if it can never be changed. But there can be changes in those who suffer trauma. I think I'll stop now, and I wonder if any of you have any questions or comments that you would like to make.